create an incident, and I'm quoting here, to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States to Jamaica or Guatemala, Panama, Venezuela, or some other country. The destination will be chosen only to cause the flight plan to cross Cuba. The passengers could be a group of college students off on holiday or any grouping of persons with a common interest to support chartering of a non-scheduled flight. And finally, and this is the report, this is something I think we should pay much attention to. The report suggested secretly paying someone in the Castro government to attack the United States. The record says that the only area remaining for a ration then would be to bribe one of Castro's subordinate commanders to initiate an attack on the United States, on Guantanamo. Now, obviously, these plans were not implemented because the president, at that time, President Kennedy, told General Lemnitzer that there was virtually no possibility that the U.S. would ever use overt military force in Cuba. But, obviously, this did not stop them. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that 9/11 was perpetrated by the U.S. government or any other organization. In fact, the truth is, I still do not know who was responsible. The strange thing is that this sort of action, the point I'm making, is that this sort of action is not necessarily bad news for the hearts in Washington. Given the history, it is not beyond the realms of possibility that many of them would have celebrated these attacks. We have to remember that it is not only Operation Northwoods. Northwood was conceived on paper, but we also have Operation Cyanide, which is now slowly emerging, where the Israeli army attacked a U.S. aircraft, a U.S. ship in the Mediterranean, and this was during the 1967 war, and brought aeroplanes which, according to some reports, they were about to bomb Cairo with weapons of mass destruction. Now, the details of this are still sketchy, but what we do know is that a large number of Americans were killed, and it was all covered up. And this was done with planes that were unmarked. So we do have precedents for this sort of thing. It does happen. So the first point I want to make here is that we should not be so naive to think that warmongering generals would be shocked and saddened by bombings and terrorist activity. Given the history, it may have quite the opposite effect. It is highly likely that they may have celebrated. The global arms trade and the war machinery in the world we live in today thrives on the back of bombings and terrorist activity. If we look at the trade statistics, there has been an exponential growth in businesses that are related to arms and other military services. Now, the second point I want to make is that, and this is addressed specifically to those Muslims who are involved directly or indirectly in the support of terrorist activity or are considering it. I want them to consider the possibility that they are being used in a complex global game. Yes, in a complex global game. We have to remember, because I think this has gone on too long. I mean, yes, in Afghanistan people were fighting jihad, they were fighting an invader. But in the wider scheme of things, this was part of a big game that the East and West were playing. It was part of the Cold War. When the Cold War came to an end and the Russians disengaged, a lot of people still went off with the idea that they had defeated Russia completely. Russia last year spent $30 billion on its military. That's not the kind of thing a defeated country does. And it's still killing, left, right, and center. So I think we need to ask ourselves, how sure are we that the deep cover embedded agent provocateurs that are sitting in your midst, in the midst of people who are planning attacks, it could be that we have agent provocateurs sitting and making what might seem sincere suggestions, but in the bigger game, in the bigger picture, it is precisely what the generals in the United States Army and Israeli Army may have ordered. They may have ordered this, who knows, given the history. I want this message to be conveyed to all, including Osama bin Laden and all those who have chosen this path. I want them to know that I share in their pain in seeing our brothers and sisters, mothers and children in Palestine and all around the world, day after day, suffering. But I also urge them to consider the bigger picture and think about the far-reaching consequences of their actions to millions of Muslims, the consequences to the opportunities for da'wah, the consequences to our future generation. You know, in my experience, one of the most difficult tasks is to convince my own people, my own Muslim brothers and sisters, of the existence of Asian provocateurs in our midst. Muslims are quick to accept far-fetched conspiracy theories that are happening far away in distant places. But when it comes to their own circle and the people sitting in their own midst, especially the people who are calling you to self-destruct at every minute, it is too much to swallow. They cannot. In our own experience, it took 3 years and being caught red-handed for an Asian provocateur to be discovered in our midst in Oxford. People would just simply not recognize him, despite my warnings. Eventually we did, but that's another story. Now, to come back to the issue of change in perspectives, change in thinking, the one I referred to earlier, this new change, which is not really new, but as I said, it was resurrected and brought to dominance. Regardless of how much they dress it up and use spin to pull the wool over people's eyes, at the basic level, this new perspective has 3 simple components. And they are: 1, all Muslims are active or potential terrorists; 2, preemption is the only solution; and 3, Islam is the ultimate cause, the ultimate obstacle, the cause for this growth in terrorism in our world today. Now, this sort of simplistic logic is not new, but as I said, it became the dominant school of thought in the aftermath of 9/11. As a direct result of this change in perception, after post 9/11, for example, we saw a 1,600% rise in attacks on Muslims in the United States. Several homes and mosques were burnt across the country from coast to coast. The attacks were numerous, and so it was also in Europe. And just to give you an idea of the sorts of thing, the Prophet ﷺ was called a terrorist on the CBS television show 60 Minutes. And one Christian coalition, the founder of the Christian coalition, a man called Reverend Pat Robertson, said that Adolf Hitler was bad, but what Muslims want to do to the Jews is worse. And this is a sort of spin. They called General William Boykin called Islam Satan and Muslims idol worshippers, who is still serving in the U.S. Army. Now, these incidents are not limited to the United States, but all over Europe. The Muslim world, the Muslims were attacked, verbally abused and spat on and physically assaulted. Now, most of these were a reaction to the Trade Center bombings, which was repeated on the television over and over. People were venting their anger. But what followed was a carefully orchestrated campaign to capitalize on the initial reaction to maintain a momentum in all levels of society. For this, the media and major think tanks were brought into service. Think tanks that they used to be institutions of objective academic research. Think tanks used to produce, the aim is to produce objective academic research, but instead, in this case, they became advocates of the new perspective. Advocacy impact being the new buzzword, seducing legislators and administration officials to adopt their policy proposals and to heed counsel on important questions is the main aim of the activity. Now, the funding game makes this easy to manipulate. Results-oriented funding is the new method. Now, the list of atrocious propaganda masquerading as academic research coming out of these think tanks is long and sickening to read.